So very briefly, everyone, I just would like to introduce Konstantin very quickly. Konstantin is the CEO and co-founder of Intento, and he has, with his experience in AI, technology, and operations, built Intento into a company that creates tools to source, evaluate, and use machine translation and other cognitive AI services. He will be speaking about enterprise MT adoption. Thank you again for the restart, Konstantin. The stage is back to yours.
Thanks. Hello, everyone. So I treat it as an almost holiday talk. I want to look back at some memorable moments we all had last year, make some resolutions. But besides that, I want to describe typical stages of technology adoption for two established markets with high fragmentation of supply, and look at how machine translation coming along this path. What steps are either solved or can be solved by enterprises on their own, and what's coming next and requires coordinated effort of all market players. So I see many of our clients and partners in the audience. Very glad to see you here. Thanks for this productive year. Nevertheless, I'll spend a little bit of time explaining what actually Intento does, because we're like that elephant in the room, dark room with 6 wise people. And depending on what part of our products you touch, lots of different opinions. Is it a wall? Is it a snake? Is it a deadly spear? Or maybe a large milky cow, or a magic carpet, or an old clay tablet? So we're not an LSP, not a TMS, not an MT vendor, not an MT buyer either. We're an AI creation platform. And we help global companies to onboard AI. About 80% of AI initiatives fail. And the reason is rarely that the AI is not there yet. The wrong vendor selected, issues while fitting the model to a specific purpose, and challenges integrating the AI solution with the existing software, business processes, and the supply chain. So for now, we've focused our efforts on the machine translation, mainly because here we see one of the most massive gaps between the AI capabilities and the enterprise adoption. And we've built a set of tools and practices to procure the right MT vendor, fitted to the purpose, integrate with the existing business processes to solve a specific task, then repurpose and reuse those models to serve many other needs across the company, and have it continuously improving as you get new data and user feedback. So some of you know me for a couple of years, which sort of tell you that I'm a complete newbie in the translation industry. Otherwise, you would know me for 20 years. And it's true. And, my imposter syndrome never was that strong. However, what Intento does in the translation industry is not a new thing. We have the industry to adopt new technology. I did that before with other technologies and other industries, and I see many things in common. For example, in 2009, we were building one of the first music streaming services in CIS, moving subscription-based music streaming to the old, entrenched 20 billion music industry, the next year after Apple released its first iPhone. And then I ran a company called Bookmate as chief operating officer, and Bookmate is basically Spotify for electronic books. Another quite similar industry, slightly bigger, 100 billion, also very fragmented supply and very outdated service delivery and pricing models. And I noticed that in all those cases, the technology adoption went through similar stages. The very first stage is solving technical obstacles to deliver the service and content to its end users. It includes integration with legacy software systems, working with all file formats and things like that. Like, for example, back in 2009, we had to build our own worldwide content delivery network and sign contracts and integrate with lots of local banks and telcos, just because back then there were no Akamai, Stripe, or Twilio. Then, once the technical problems are solved and users can access the service, you need to make sure that the quality is first good enough, then it's at least as good as they had it before in the old format, and then that it becomes superior because of your new technology. And only after that, you have the potential to gain user traction, But to do that, you need to solve the user experience problem. And it involves understanding how users behaved before, how it will change with the new technology, and how to make them change their habits. For example, in music, it was a challenge to make people stop thinking about music as files and CDs, and explaining that music is actually what you listen to minus the time you spend to discover it. And in books, it was to make them spend their 20-minute commute time reading a book instead of browsing a Facebook. And finally, when everything just works, the quality is outstanding and end users love it, the technology starts to gain traction on the market. And any established market has its value chain where this end user value is built. And with the end user onboards new value, when the end user onboards the new value add service, the existing value chain is rebalanced. And as the value chain is rebalanced, the unit price for the end users and suppliers typically goes down, but the volume goes much higher as the market makes the next leap of growth, which we've recently seen both in music and book industries. However, of course, suppliers have concerns. Will the new technology cannibalize their existing revenues? Will the volumes really go up? How much effort it will take for them to adjust? And will they still be number one? And the thing is, at this moment, the market is already past the tipping point. And the right strategy here, if you can stop it, lead it. So now if you look at the history of machine translation, you see it goes along the same way. And we intend to do our best to facilitate it. There's one unique thing here which makes MT adoption special. Machine translation, as any other AI, is not quite software. As a result, the practices developed over the last 3 or 4 decades to procure, deploy, and maintain software systems are not very efficient when they apply to AI. And the very fact that AI is being treated as software accounts for the vast majority of those failed initiatives. And briefly, what makes it different is that, well, you need to train and evaluate it on your own data before selecting the vendor. And for global companies with many language pairs and systems to integrate, there is often no best vendor, so you have to combine many. Then traditional approach to software integration doesn't really work with many-to-many connections, which is necessary for integrating AI services into the enterprise infrastructure. And finally, you cannot just deploy machine translation and leave it be for the next 3 years. You continuously get new data and new user feedback, and also technology evolves rapidly. So you need to implement continuous improvement rather than just maintenance. And the first challenge, again, was purely technical. Despite doing the same thing, every MT vendor has its own API. Moreover, as we see, the APIs get updated with every major technology release. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had exciting new active custom translation from Amazon, has a new API. Then it's not just about having single API to call those different MT services. They need to be used across multiple enterprise systems, such as TMS, customer support, CMS, many others. And implementing this many-to-many scenarios requires an exponential number of places you need to replicate the integration code. This problem can be solved by integration hubs, which do what's called semantic mediation and encapsulate all those complexities related to work with multiple MT systems and multiple internal systems. And we sell our own, and I know that some large enterprises wrote some versions of what we have on their own in parallel of us building that. And now imagine this technical issue is solved. So now you can use any combination of the available MT systems. So the next question you have, which ones? And unlike in software case, you cannot just go to your procurement and have it solved through some RFP with feature checkboxes and prices. you need to make your hands dirty to compare all the systems on your data. And then not the off-the-shelf systems, but the versions of the proper domain adaptation, custom terminology applied, and so on. And then you see how those systems train also depends on your data. So we've shared some information together with one of our clients at Lockworld. After the proper evaluation for 30 language pairs, we got a mix of custom and stock engines across 5 to 7 different MT platforms, depending on the domain and scenario. And we also shared some data on the quality estimates we see, with on average 60% of content approved as good by post editors and 90% by end users. And surprisingly, in production, we see even better performance, perhaps because in the evaluation process, reviewers know something is going on and show some excessive criticism. So next comes the user experience challenge. For machine translation, it's twofold. For the raw, real-time machine translation scenarios, it's about having machine translation at your fingertips without a need to copy and paste or to use another software tool. And this is solved through seamless integrations with various enterprise software systems. And there's an interesting byproduct of those integrations is that very often localization department doesn't have enough IT budget to properly cook machine translation on their own. And delivering MT across the company enables many other departments to get MT ROI and contribute their own budgets to the MT curation program. For post-edited machine translation, the user experience is about changing how human translators work, so it's harder. And I had a chat with one LSP from France. They explained me that their translators with 30 to 40 years of experience, they don't actually look to the target segment. They just read the source and blind type the translation. So for them, it's super hard to use MT. And we see this difference in our evaluations. Depending on the MT engine, the post-editing time may differ 4 times, while depending on the post-editor, so this specific particular human person, it differs 10 times. So ideally, you optimize the human part first, but then you can't do that without high-quality machine translation. So it creates sort of chicken-egg problem here, which is luckily easy to solve. You just start MT program from the most important language pair and project, get the best machine translation, then polish all the workflows and then scale to other language pairs. And there's already sufficient population of trained post editors, and we see LSPs reporting tremendous productivity gains more and more often. Like, for example, in this case of E2F, which you work with, which they presented at Localize conference, where they went from 300 to 1200 words per hour by applying machine translation with tone of voice control. And again, imagine now that you have your best fit MT portfolio that's available across all the software systems you want, delivering a decent quality and improving over time. So for real-time machine translation scenarios, such as customer support or communication, you get your ROI naturally, right away, through improved user satisfaction. So as when you have in-house translators. Now, for traditional localization with human translation post-editing, you don't. The most popular way to price post-editing is a flat discount, which just really depends on the MT quality and goes below fuzzy match editing. This is surprising, isn't it? You pay for effort saving through AI, but what you pay doesn't really depend on the AI quality and on your investments into improving it. It's not quite fair. Why develop the technology if you pay the same, right? And interestingly, raising this discount doesn't help either. It just becomes unfair towards translators. And one of the reasons why such a simplistic model prevails is long supply chains and fragmentation, because the actual effort is hard to track across all the subcontractors and TMS, CAD project management system involved. And the existing contracts are hard to adjust, right? And another reason is the uncertainty in the MT quality. If for some reason it didn't work, the small discount may be absorbed by the LSP margins or projected to subcontractors. And another reason which probably doesn't help with new pricing models to emerge is the fear that the new model will lead to losing the business. And there is an old story from the mid-19th century called JEVONS paradox. So in short, it's about people found a way how to make steam engines much more efficient. And everyone was really afraid that the coal consumption would collapse together with the whole coal mining industry, making the miners losing their jobs. But in fact, what happened was that with a reduced steam power price, people found many other ways to use steam power. For example, railroads. The coal consumption soared, so as the environmental damage, and the governments even had to impose restrictions on the coal usage to protect the environment. And we see signs something like that happening in the translation industry as well. With a prohibitive human translation price, an enterprise translates around 5% of all content they want to have translated. So lowering the post-editing cost enables them to translate more with the human level quality. But then you may notice that this additional content, it comes from different departments, meaning that enable them to translate this content unlocks more budgets, raising the total monetary volume. And the rest of the content goes through raw machine translation. As most of this content is real time and can't really afford neither price or delay of the human touch. And we already see around 95% user satisfaction for such cases. However, the remaining 3% of user complaints are not just some, managerial KPI. It indicates valuable feedback which needs to be processed by linguists and used to improve the machine translation even further. And again, those are entirely different enterprise departments with their own budgets. So just 3% extra to the linguist job, but it's 3% out of 95%, which may well double the post-editing volume. So the reason flat discounts are no longer good is that the properly curated machine translation yields up to 70% of perfect translations. And by perfect, I mean left unchanged after post-editing, LSP review, and in-country review. And we see it in real-life production projects. However, this effort saving depends on the source content, on the available training data, and also on the requirements. And discounts of this size, they cannot be absorbed anymore. So if the discounts are low, it hurts the buyers, we still can't translate all they want fast enough. And if the discounts are high, which happens sometimes when a buyer has lots of leverage on the supplier, it hurts the translators and eventually the buyer too, as the quality drops. So what other cost models may work better for companies who invest in machine translation and want to see the post-editing ROI? Some LSP measure the actual effort in hours and charge time materials. So this probably works if the translators are within reach and work in controlled environment, or the project is large enough to hire them full-time and have flexible budget or timeline. And I mentioned here some of the LSP names we work with, and now about them that they use those models. So then we have seen how some enterprises implement in-house MT validation when before sending content to post-editing, the perfect strings are locked, and sometimes even some sorting happens to different type of post-editing. Then there are attempts to overcome the effort tracking complexity by measuring the effort using some sort of proxy metrics, such as an edit distance. Overall, it just makes things worse, as the costs become not only unpredictable, but also uncorrelated with the actual effort. So we strongly advise against this approach. A better way to pricing by actual activities, where perfect segments are charged by the review rate, while the post-editing is charged by the discounted rate. And it already allows for some ROI from improving machine translation through increased share of perfect segments. Then another, probably the most popular approach, is to run a test project, typically at the full rate, to estimate the custom discount for the whole project. But however, anyway, the cost estimate approach is not good enough when it comes to potential 70% cost saving on one hand. And on another hand, actual effort approach is too unpredictable. So we see here a viable solution developed over the years in some other service industries, which is based on the service level agreements. Consider this data from a real project, one of our customers ran recently. You see about 90% going to machine translation, with about half of that being perfect segments. The rest are different editing activities of various effort. And getting, estimate discounts for those activities, we can estimate overall translation effort and sort of potential discount around 50%. And statistics like that can be used by the parties to agree on the expected number of perfect segments, almost perfect segments, and retranslations, which form the service level agreement. And despite LSP as a service provider, this SLA actually provided by the enterprise to the LSP. And this SLA defines the quality of the machine translation. And if the project is within these boundaries, the LSP provides a discount close to the actual effort saving, and it's safe for them because there is no contingency involved. For the escalations, meaning additional work rendered because of the less than expected quality of the MT, it's based on the top, according to the type of the created overhead. And this idea can be expanded as the SLA fulfillment depends not only on the machine translation quality, but also on the source content quality. And then similar approach could be applied to cover TM and repetition edits. And such an SLA model enables LSP to provide fair discounts free of contingency and risk aversions. And it's available for most of the TMS systems, as the SLA fulfillment is calculated automatically by just comparing pre-translation with the final project. And it's sort of fair to both translation buyers and vendors, meaning it also benefits the technology vendors, like us, because finally the buyers has a reason to further improve machine translation. So, final remarks. I'm confident that machine translation as new technology is already past solving technical quality and user experience problems in its enterprise adoption. It's not easy because MT seems similar to software while it's not, and making it right requires special processes, experts, and tools, which you can either develop in-house or buy. And now you can build enterprise solutions with real-time machine translation and immediately recognize the ROI. Now, for high-impact content, when you need to have post-editing, the ROI is still locked by legacy cost models and supply chain. It doesn't mean that the MT has reached its limits, and that's the only remaining bottleneck. So by any means, it's far from that. However, to invest in MT improvement, one needs to recognize the ROI. And most of the translation industry is revenue from human services. So it becomes one of the main bottlenecks in MT adoption to have this ROI. And I've discussed this SLA-based model with some of the world's largest translation buyers, and they seem pretty excited about it. Some of the largest translation vendors, let me say this way, seem to be carefully optimistic, while small and medium LSPs with shorter supply chains and smaller contracts at risk, ready to go. And I think we're currently precisely in Nash equilibrium situation, when everyone spent enough time optimizing their own strategy. And for the next leap, all players need to coordinate their efforts. And this way we'll be able to get the human-machine cooperation, which is fair to all the players, including translation buyers, human translators, and also other humans who build the machines. Thank you very much. That's it.
Thank you, Konstantin, for that very informative presentation. We've run a bit long, but we have a couple of questions and we want to try and fit them in. So they seem to be two sides of the same coin. Ida and Catherine Ida and Jean are talking about difficulties they're having. So Ada is talking about the difficulties they've had with MT with art and literature. The amount of post-editing is so high that it does not make sense. Do you have any recommendations as to what to work with for that would work better and be more with free-form text, i.e. like movie scripts?
So do you mean for literature?
Well, she's having difficulty with art and literature, and the amount of post-editing is too high. And she's asking for a recommendation as what might work better with more free-form text, like movie scripts.
Yeah, well, I still have some connection to the book industry, and I know that it's still a large problem using machine translation for fiction, definitely. For non-fiction, it's already maybe quite good. And actually, just last week, there was a book published in Russia where it was machine translated, and the segments which left unedited were specifically highlighted in the book. And it's a book about automation, so it's quite interesting project. You may see quite lots of segments left unedited. So, in terms of movie scripts, we see it works pretty well. We already have some pilots. It works especially well for educational videos. The only problem is that it requires additional things beyond just customization, custom terminology. So it's hugely important to have tone of voice and gender control for this type of content. Otherwise, it quickly turns into a mess.
So we have a similar question from Jean that I think we're going to save for a follow-up in writing because we'd like to get to the positive. Catherine asks, can you share some examples of a successful implementation of this technology so far, and what are the specific use cases? Well,
we shared quite a bit at Lockwork together with IKEA, where there was, I think, there's a total of 10 to 15 use cases, and I hope that next Lockwork, IKEA will share even more. It's customer service, definitely, and including live chats. It's, of course, traditional localization. It's agile localization with CI/CD processes, right? It's all sorts of communication and office productivity and community management.
Okay, well, I think we'll try to find a way in the follow-up of this event to perhaps share more of those use cases, because I think that's where people are looking for the result. I think we'll ask one more question from Konstantin. In this model, what do we do with the leverage that comes from MT? How does it come in the equation? I know you touched on this, you gave an example, and there were some metrics there. So how does this, again, maybe equate into the pricing model or the savings model for the client?
Yeah, so I said what's the right way is that basically when you set up the machine translation, you, of course, do quality checks. And when you do those quality checks, you estimate, what types of activities, you estimate this SLA. How many segments you expect to get perfect, how many segments you expect to get really bad, and what's in between. So use this SLA to define a fair discount. And after the actual project is run, you can see if it's below the discount, if it's far below the discount, the SLA, you still pay the agreed price to the LSP. And if there's some overhead above the SLA, then you pay extra. So that's basically the model we see that probably will work in the future.
Okay, well, I guess that might work to perhaps fix budgets where people can work to that sort of framework. Well, thank you very much, Konstantin, for sharing your insights on the adoption of NT. We're going to see how we can extend this Q&A, so please stay in the event and make yourself available, particularly for networking as well. And as I said, we'll follow up with written replies on these questions. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks.